Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. US President Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address to Congress, strongly defending tariffs as a pillar of his economic and national security strategy, even suggesting that tariff revenue could replace income tax. But a recent Supreme Court ruling has challenged his tariff authority. What happens next? Well, to unpack the legal and economic implications, we are joined by Tomasz Płudowski. He's Associate Professor at Vizja University. Professor, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Good evening. So, overview, big picture. Have the tariffs worked?
Well, I mean, it depends for what. They didn't deliver on the main campaign promise. In other words, to bring jobs back. The main purpose of imposing tariffs was to reindustrialize the United States after the outsourcing of jobs that's been taking place at least since the 80s under basically all presidents. That hasn't happened. Those jobs haven't returned, which is not surprising. Those jobs are still in other countries where labor is much cheaper. But they have worked in terms of limiting or lowering the US budget deficit. The revenue is not very high. It's still much lower than the revenue from the individual income tax. So as far as the US economy and the US budget is concerned, I mean, one is not going to replace the other. I think it was part of the promise that Trump made to kind of go back to make America great again, to use his slogan borrowed from Reagan. And if you go back to the beginnings of the US as a country, indeed, the US did not have income tax and at first, and then the income tax was very low, but it maintained business relations with many countries, as George Washington suggested in his farewell address. He said, do not have steady allies, because if you have regular or steady allies, then you're going to have enemies. So have maintained good relations, business relations with all countries as far as you can, and draw income from tariffs and doing business with those countries. Obviously, nowadays it's not possible to go back to those countries to have no income tax or very low income tax. I mean, let me remind you that even under Reagan, when income tax was lowered, still at the beginning of most for this post-war period, the 60s, 70s, income taxes were very high. So for the highest income tax was probably about 80%, and America still made was a leading economy, was a great power. A lot of progress was made, a lot of advances in science, and so on and so forth. But then, starting with Reagan, taxes were lowered for the richest Americans, and they have maintained relatively low, and usually Republican presidents and candidates promise to lower taxes for the rich, and Democratic candidates promise to increase taxes for the rich. And they go back and forth, but we do not go back to very high taxes or very low taxes, and what Trump promised he did not deliver.
Okay, well let's see what he said in his address, because he refers to what he'd said last year. Let's have a listen.
You've seen nothing yet. We're going to do better and better and better. This is the golden age of America. When I last spoke in this chamber 12 months ago, I had just inherited a nation in crisis with a stagnant economy, inflation at record levels, a wide open border, horrendous recruitment for military and police, rampant crime at home, and wars and chaos all over the world. But tonight, after just 1 year, I can say with dignity and pride that we have achieved a transformation like no one has ever seen before, and a turnaround for the ages. It is indeed a turnaround for the ages.
The turnaround for the ages. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's he's a media and advertising guy, so he knows how to advertise himself. He exaggerates on most issues.
But he does have a couple of points, doesn't he? I mean, for example, the border, or for example, inflation that's come down a little bit. What's he doing right? What could he do better?
It is true that there are fewer immigrants, illegal immigrants. Especially crossing the border illegally. That is true. What is questionable are the methods, the way ICE has been acting, especially shooting American citizens that had nothing to do with immigration in the back. Even if they were illegal immigrants, this is not a method to deal with immigration. And the U.S. is a country of immigrants, illegal immigrants. It's possible for immigrants, even illegal ones, to have false social security number and pay taxes and consider themselves upstanding citizens. So you could say, especially if you think that there are too many illegal immigrants and they shouldn't be there in the first place, then he has been more effective than the previous governments. But the difference is not as shocking, I would say. But the rhetoric has changed. Obama was also much more aggressive towards illegal immigrants or immigrants in general, including children, than his rhetoric. So a lot of voters think that his policies were much more lenient, whereas in reality he also sent a lot of illegal immigrants back or abroad. In terms of inflation was indeed very high, the highest in 2022. It was the highest in decades. It had more to do with COVID. And when Trump came into office, it wasn't the highest. Biden managed to bring it down, so it wasn't all Trump. Usually, the reality, I mean, you have to look at the context, and sometimes data changes from month to month, and it isn't the difference between Trump versus Biden. It's much more complex, and it isn't just Trump. He has done some things right, but in terms of new jobs, job increase, and about how he phrases things. For example, he says that there have never been more jobs in the U.S. or more Americans working. Obviously, it depends how you phrase things. The number of Americans is on the increase steadily. So if you look at the general terms, obviously there's more Americans, there's more legal Americans, there's more employed Americans, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the rate at which jobs are increasing, it is much lower recently. So he hasn't been able to maintain the high rate of new job increase, and this is going to be a problem for him.
Right. So a mixed bag.
Affordability is a big word.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes, it's a mixed bag.
Just tell us a little bit about affordability, because I do want to come on to something else in just a second, but please do complete that thought.
Okay. In political science, pocketbook voting is a big theory, and economic aspects, which voters have direct experience with, are very often, especially in a crisis, the number one criterion that they base their decision on. So if prices are high or there's less money left in the pockets, they obviously are more likely to vote against whoever is currently in power. So this is a big problem for the Republicans, because affordability is high, and he tries to blame it on Biden, but prices are still high. Food prices, some that he mentions, have come down, but still, on average, the increase recently has been almost 3%. So, I mean, sometimes people talk about individual products like eggs, for example, but generally affordability is still not very high. It's much lower than in previous generations and previous decades. And the youngest generation is not in a better position than the older generations, unlike for most of recent post-war history. So it's more difficult to maintain, to buy apartments, to get credit, to buy cars, not just food.
Sorry to interrupt you, but there is one last question I'd like to squeeze in the last minute that we have. Going back to the tariffs for a second, how has that affected his relationship with allies? You mentioned that historically presidents have said, don't make friends. How would you characterize his foreign policy in terms of his relationships with, for example, Europe?
Well, he has been very unpredictable. This is very unlikely for American presidents. He has been more unpredictable than, say, China, and Europe is learning how to deal with him. They tried different ways. For example, Switzerland has tried to bribe him, bringing him gold. Somebody called him, trying to convince him to lower tariffs, and because he did not like the way that particular leader talked to him, he, in contrast, increased the tariffs. So it seems like a lot is dependent on the mood that he is in, how he likes a particular person, and it's not a steady, predictable policy that he makes, and that's why it's difficult to maintain relationships. And he has also brought a lot of American companies into bankruptcy also because they suffered. It's mostly, contrary to what he promised, what he said, it is mostly American consumers that pay the cost of those tariffs. It's not that they can give up many products. Obviously, if you're into a particular kind of luxury alcohol from France, you can maybe give up that or not pay much attention to what the tariff is. But for most consumers, they still carry the price and pay the price. So it's not just Europeans; it's mostly American companies and American consumers
for the tariffs.
Yes.
Understood, Professor. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up there. But thank you, as always, for sharing your analysis. A very mixed bag, as you say, and we shall see what happens during the midterms in November. Have a good evening, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Bye-bye. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.